The name of the foundation comes from the last line of his obituary, and that's something that my brother wrote, and it read, "Please go and enjoy your life." Danny did.
I'm Kent Leyde, CEO of Cadence Neuroscience.
And I'm Doug Sheffield, Chief Scientific Officer.
You're listening to Seizure Diaries, where we explore all things epilepsy and explore the latest developments in epilepsy science and therapy.
Together, and with expert guests, we discuss the impact of epilepsy and the work being done by Cadence Neuroscience and others with the ultimate goal that every person lives a seizure-free life. Welcome.
Tom Stanton, welcome. Good to see you.
Thanks, Kent. Good to see you too. Great to see you, Doug.
Excellent to see you.
So welcome to our little corner of the podcast universe. And thanks for joining us. You're our first guest, by the way. So
No, I'm honored. I'm expecting a t-shirt or a hat in the mail.
Okay, we'll see what we can
First
do.
guest.
Well, thanks again for joining us. Our podcast series got a number of themes to it. And one of the themes that we are most interested in is us helping ourselves and other people understand the unmet need and our customers and what challenges they face and what's living with epilepsy like, and by implication, what can organizations like Cadence do to be helpful? And given that we're working on, our program is centered on therapies for pediatric patients with epilepsy, we thought, well, it seemed like there's no better place to start than DannyDid.org, since we share that element of our missions. So can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on. It's always helpful for us to reach new people and new audiences. And, our foundation was started in 2010 after my nephew, Danny, passed away from something called sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, or SUDEP. He was a great kid. He was the third of four children, older brother, older sister, and a younger brother. Just loved life.
How old was he?
He was 4 years old, almost 5 when he passed. And
I have grandkids that age, so
Yeah, he was a little guy, but he packed a lot of punch, and being kind of a middle child, he ran around with his older brother John all the time, and he was just a beloved kid in the neighborhood. Always outside, always playing sports, chasing the ice cream truck. In Danny's life, I didn't have children at that time, and those guys were like kids to me. So we spent a lot of good days together and have great memories of Danny's life. But SUDEP is what ended his life, and it was an acronym that his parents had never heard of.
Had they not heard about it at the time? I've heard this unfortunately from a number of people, similar stories.
That's correct. Yeah. The first time they saw the term was on his death certificate, and they thought, what is this? It was just, you think about these tragedies and they're horrible in any scenario, but I think the added layer of grief where you were unaware of the risk just is unique to epilepsy for a lot of families, in the sense that it wasn't part of the prospects. It wasn't part of the horizon of possibilities as far as the caretaker knows, in this case, Danny's parents. And so that was really, I think, the impetus to say, this isn't right. This isn't the standard of care, lack of communication that other families should have to deal with. And that really drove Danny's dad to want to start the foundation and help people avoid that blind spot to the degree that we could help get the word out.
Have you seen over the years now, improvements in clinician, patient, and family communication, so that that's become, from your perspective, is that becoming a more standard expectation of communication, that SUDEP exists and that the risk exists for patients with uncontrolled seizures?
Well, I think there's been some improvement. It certainly hasn't been to the degree that we'd hoped. 15 years ago when we started, the only real communications were to high-risk populations, so people with uncontrolled seizures. And Danny was, in a scenario where he had nocturnal seizures, but he only had 4 of them that his parents ever witnessed over 2.5 years. So the volume was relatively low. And so for a lot of doctors, he wouldn't fall into that category of high risk. And so it's been an important part of our messaging to say, everybody, who has a diagnosis of epilepsy, unfortunately, is at risk for this thing called SUDEP. And we really try to encourage them providers to couch this topic within the larger topic of safety. So when they're talking about, potential issues or risks with swimming, or if the person is of
Mm-hmm.
driving age,
Mm-hmm.
or accidents and injuries, or the possibility for status, um, to include SUDEP in that larger conversation, and then that opens the door for more extended conversations if those are of interest to the parents, or if it's an adult patient, or if the doctor warrants that there's an especially high risk. It kind of just introduces the topic in a way that is couched within this lineup of risk factors.
Is there work ongoing towards a consensus statement, practice guideline, or something that would ensure or, help establish that this should be expected communication from clinicians?
So AES and AAN put out a guideline around SUDEP in 2017. And part of that included a recommendation that all people affected by epilepsy should be counseled about the risk.
Okay.
So it was an improvement in the sense that it didn't stratify or eliminate people who were certain populations within the epilepsy community. We at the time had hoped that it would be kind of a more definitive statement. It was a recommendation that the conversation be held. So that's something we can refer to, and something that exists when we talk to providers and encourage them, say, this is what the community wants. There's been different studies and surveys around the topic of SUDEP. In fact, just about a year and a half ago, we partnered with the Epilepsy Foundation and a team at Duke University to survey families impacted by epilepsy, specifically families who had lost a loved one. And it was pretty overwhelming in terms of the percentages that wanted to be informed. And it was pretty much in line with other surveys we had seen. Typically you're looking at 90 to 98% of respondents that say they want to be
Mm-hmm.
informed. There's always a few exceptions for various reasons. And then the typical disclosure rate is, somewhere in the 30%, 30 to 35%.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So there's still a lot of road to cover.
Yeah, there's still a disconnect, I think, between what the community wants and what currently exists as far as like the standard. And that's different in certain um, populations, like, for example, the Dravet syndrome community or the LGS community. They tend to have a much higher awareness level, unfortunately, because there's a higher incidence level of losing friends and loved ones.
Is that also because they've made it up to a tertiary center and have kind of likely graduated beyond treatment from the community neurologist?
I think that's probably a factor as well. Just the idea that most of them, if not all of them, are seeing specialists, and that information is more likely to be communicated by epileptologists.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one positive trend that we've seen is the overall awareness of the risk of SUDEP and other forms of mortality in epilepsy has definitely increased in the last 15 years. And a lot of that has been driven by families and advocacy groups that are more open to making that a priority in terms of informing the community, hey, this is something that you should be aware of. So it hasn't necessarily been driven always on the provider side, which is specifically what most caregivers want. They want to have that conversation with their provider specifically. But I think there's a improvement to some degree in terms of like just knowing that this is a risk factor to be aware of. And then that gives them enough information to go ask their doctor, hey, what's this about? But ideally, we would say that shouldn't be on the patient or the parent to have to initiate.
Tom, I have a question for you. In a previous life, Kent and I were working on a seizure prediction device. This company called Neurovista. And one of our goals is for people like Danny, whose parents didn't know who Danny was having those seizures that night, that there would be a way that we could alert either patients who are perhaps older or caregivers that patient was undergoing seizures. It certainly opened our eyes to the need of, especially for those nocturnal seizures, to have some way of making the caregivers aware of it. So what are you seeing going on in the field of developing new technology so patients or caregivers aren't surprised when they wake up in the morning and see the results of those nocturnal seizures?
Yeah, it's a good point, Doug, that most of this scenario does happen, with the person found in the morning in bed. So I think that's something just to be aware of for families and people with epilepsy. Is just that idea that, there are a lot of seizures that happen during sleep. That was news to us. I remember not even realizing that that was possible when I learned about Danny's diagnosis. So just the idea that seizures do occur during sleep for a lot of people, and for some people it's exclusive, like it was for Danny. His seizures were only while he was sleeping. But I think that idea of intervention, that is really important to the community.
Hmm.
That you could become present and be with that person, do a well-being check. And that's not to say we can guarantee that Danny or others like him would be here with us, but I think having that opportunity to be present is really important.
Yeah.
There are some, but there's not a lot of cases of SUDEP that have been witnessed. And the idea that if someone else is present, there may well be a different outcome, a better outcome.
Right. There's a number of papers supporting that, right? That if patients have a sleeping partner, a bedtime buddy, I have never heard this explained as to a possible mechanism, but people have recorded substantial differences in outcomes based on having a sleeping buddy, right?
Yeah, I think that's one, recommendations, if somebody's away at college or you've got a young person living in an apartment, just having someone else with them is advisable and helpful, because if you're there, you can check and make sure that they're not wedged into a pillow and suffocating, or they've fallen out of bed and
Mm-hmm.
they've hit their head, or
Right.
they're generally unresponsive. So that's a factor that we're kind of motivated by in terms of reviewing these different technologies. Is, can it help spark intervention? Can it do it within a time frame that's meaningful? Is there a way to share some of that data or potentially video with the provider to help the treatment become optimized? Maybe there's more seizures happening than the family thought, or maybe there's fewer seizures happening than they thought. But I think, these systems are becoming more sophisticated in terms of what they can detect. I think historically there's been a pretty strong lineup of things that can detect movement that mimics seizure activity, but looking into things that are indicators like changes in heart rate or changes in respiration or lack of breathing to kind of align with this different seizure types is hopefully where the space is heading and getting better. And then, Doug, you mentioned prediction or forecasting. Those technologies I think are evolving and are super meaningful in the sense of quality of life. What should I plan for the day? Should I think about avoiding driving today? Should I maybe work from home? Should we keep our child home from school? Those are all quality of life factors that are really important. But I think ultimately finding a system that can detect and allow intervention, but maybe
Right.
have some kind of
Right.
intervention built in to suppress the seizure from even happening is ultimately the kind of the holy grail.
Yep.
Yep.
That would be really meaningful. And there's a few companies that are kind of working in towards that trajectory.
You probably know we're working closely with Mayo Clinic in developing our therapy, and we're constantly reminded of the importance of sleep state as we're looking at effects of neuromodulation, that what might work on an awake patient may be very different than what's most effective for a patient who's sleeping. So we're constantly reminded by Mayo that as we are developing our therapies, that we need to understand the effect of sleep state on how stimulation might stop a seizure from
Yeah.
occurring.
Yeah, they're so intertwined. Sleep and epilepsy and
Yeah.
seizures. It's just such a closely knitted factor.
Yeah.
And that complex cascade of events that can lead to SUDEP. I think if you can break the chain somewhere in there, I think it's potentially one of those kind of problems.
Kent and I heard an amazing story from a recent meeting about a somebody up in Boston, an epileptologist who had a patient with severe status problems where they had to induce coma in this patient just to control the status, and how she worked through a series of really remarkable efforts to find the right stimulation frequency that stopped the seizures. The more Kent and I are aware of the unmet need and how that might impact what we're doing, I think it would be good to hear your perspective. We want to stay connected, as Kent said, to the patients that we hope to bring benefits to. So you're much closer to that. I was on your website yesterday just looking at some of your ambassadors, and the stories on your website are really important to
Yeah.
help us become more aware of what problems are and how we might be able to help.
Yeah, I think, what we chose as our lane for Danny did was twofold. One being awareness and education around the risks that come with epilepsy and specifically the risk of SUDEP. But the second lane in tandem with that is really how can we empower patients and families to know what else is out there that could complement their medication. So empowering them with enough knowledge to even know that technology is a complementary category.
Yeah.
There's more than just searching for the next seizure med. And the seizure meds are gonna help a lot of people. And but there's a third of people with epilepsy that are not controlled by medication, and there's more to try than looking for the next one. So
Right.
a lot of what we do is to help them think through what should they be considering when they think about technologies that could support their care. How does the system align with their seizure type? What will their child or loved one be comfortable to wear if it's a wearable? Does the person want to be on a video camera if it's a video based system? So, just thinking through these practical considerations and helping them hopefully land at one or two options that are meaningful to them. Our goal is not to say, here's what you should choose, here's the best product. It's really just to give them enough education to know, okay, if I'm really looking to be alerted during a nocturnal seizure, here's a few good options. If we've tried a lot of different medications and a wearable doesn't work, what kind of neurostimulation options might be out there? Of those, which of them are available for children? Just kind of thinking through these categories of potential support, all with the backdrop of, as you both know now, like so much anxiety, so much fear about when's the next seizure? Is my loved one going to be alone during it? How can we keep them safe? How can we help them gain some independence? Especially for teens and young adults who want to kind of live life in a way that's
Yeah.
somewhat on track with their peers. So there's all these different considerations based on the very individual circumstances that the family is in with age and chapter of life and seizure frequency. And
Can you speak a little bit to just, the caregiver burden? I think when we're talking about the sleeping buddies, and if that's your job to sleep with your child every night, can you share just a little bit what that burden is for that caregiver and what that's like for a family?
I mean, we hear from families all the time about that scenario. It's constant. It's unrelenting. The lack of sleep. I know Danny's parents would do a rotation of bed checks, on the hour, just to kind of go in and see how he's doing. And
Yeah.
there's parents that will sleep on the floor next to their child's bed or have the child in their bed with them. I've heard of spouses who have tied bells together at their ankle so that if the person with epilepsy was having a seizure, the spouse could hear that. It's just we'll hear parents that say, I haven't slept in 6 years, or I haven't slept normally in 8 years. And it makes the day-to-day care for the person who needs the care really an added challenge.
Yeah.
Because there's this constant state of exhaustion. So I think that the whole issue of sleep for caregivers is almost as important as the importance of sleep for the person with epilepsy. And how can we create that environment for them to the point where they have some peace of mind to know that, hey, if something happens here, either I'm going to be alerted or, hopefully one day there's a system, a technology that will do an intervention on its own to the point where I can really feel comfortable to get some meaningful sleep.
Is Danny Did providing a channel or a hub for families to get together and, kind of support group style, trade notes on these kinds of experiences?
So we have events that kind of serve those purposes, some in locally in Chicago, but for virtual support, it's a lot of referrals out to resources within the Epilepsy Foundation. A lot of those chapters and affiliates have local groups that are available to kind of trade notes and share stories. Another thing we're involved with is called Epilepsy Awareness Day at Disneyland.
Oh, cool.
We provide, yeah, it's a super fun event. And
When is that? Tell us more about that.
yeah, it's in November. I want to say this is the 15th annual. It's run by an incredible pair of parents named Brad and Candy Levy. They have a daughter named Sophie who fortunately found success through epilepsy surgery and has been doing great for many years. She's in her early 20s and she's become a great ambassador.
Great.
But they've hosted this event in Anaheim now for many years, and I want to say, nearly 4,000 people come. Don't quote me on the dates, but it's mid-November every year. And what it is it's 2 days of an expo where you'll get companies like Cadence or other technology companies in the epilepsy space who have tables. You'll have epilepsy centers who have tables. You'll have advocacy groups like Danny did who have tables, seizure dog resources, medication, pharma companies, really everything under the umbrella that you might want to have access to is at this expo. So there's 2 days of the expo, and then on the third day, and the expo is free, which is great. On the third day, everybody who attends goes into the theme park together and wears purple shirts.
Fantastic.
It's just a great community building place where kids or adults with epilepsy can go and be with other people who kind of get it.
Yeah, not alone. We're not in this fight by ourselves.
Not alone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Parents trade notes. They keep in touch. We give out about 35 travel grants a year to get families
Fantastic.
out there. And the stories we hear from them, not just in the near-term aftermath, but years later, are really incredible. Like kids keeping in touch and becoming friends. And so I think the social bonds that are created there are almost as important as the education they receive at the expo. It's a really, really cool event.
That's really cool. I'm going to guess that people listening to this would think that's really neat. That's the kind of thing I'd like to support. How do people get behind this? You guys, none of these things are free. And, there's a lot of things we can spend money on besides our cup of coffee at Starbucks.
Yeah.
How do people ship in and help out?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Ken. So there's all sorts of ways to get involved with a foundation like ours. We have, you mentioned the family ambassadors that I think we have in about 19 states. So that's a program where it's really, we kind of consider them like super volunteers. All of them have a direct connection to epilepsy. Some of them have lost a loved one to epilepsy, specifically SUDEP. So that's one program that we talk about on our website as kind of an elevated way to engage with us. But there are things that we do. One example, we have something called Team Danny Did, where if someone wants to do a walk or a half marathon or a marathon or a bike ride, any kind of a thon is a term we use, and turn that into a fundraiser for our cause. It's a wonderful way for us to kind of get into circles of giving that we wouldn't have a direct connection to. So the biggest example of that is we have 90 runners do the Chicago Marathon for us every October.
Okay. Cool.
And they come from all over the country. They each raise, I don't know, on average, call it $2,500. And
Oh, wow.
it's really it's a meaningful amount of money raised.
How about that?
But there's something as simple as just making donations through the website or coming out to support an event. Some people are moved to like host an event in their community, to kind of get us. We have pretty strong Midwest roots in terms of fundraising and support, but we want to get into all parts of the country because we help people nationally, and we've helped people across 18 countries.
Wow. Oh, really? Okay. Huh.
Yeah, our signature program, which I should have mentioned earlier, is really to help counsel families about what types of non-invasive technologies could potentially support their treatment plan. If they can't afford these systems, we give them a grant that allows them to place the order and have the funds taken out of the equation. And a lot of the systems will have like an upfront hardware cost and then a monthly subscription cost. So the way we set it up is that we'll cover like the first 12 months so that they have a runway of time to evaluate, is this working? So that's kind of what our most typical request is. What is out there in the way of these devices that could be helpful, and then bridging that funding gap, because
Sure.
right now, as I think you're both aware, the reimbursement and the insurance coverage is a real hurdle for a lot of these systems.
Yeah, it's kind of non-existent for
Yeah.
a lot of those kind of systems. Yeah.
Tom, I want to return to an earlier sort of theme that I think is going through this podcast, and that's the awareness issue. And, this is a huge problem. And I'd like your thoughts on, for folks like Kent and I and our company, how do we keep the eye on the patient, and how do we become more aware? We're so focused every day on the tasks that we're involved with developing and commercializing this technology and those challenges, but sometimes I feel we're not as close as we should be to the personal side of it. And I know meeting you once a year and AES is always recharges my battery, and seeing your enthusiasm for the cause. Any thoughts on how Cadence can be more focused on the people we're trying to benefit?
Yeah, that's a great question, Doug. And I think it's really important that Cadence and any company in our space thinks in those terms, and does it on the front end, which I know you guys have done. And I say that in the sense of like, what does the patient want? What does the caregiver want? What are they willing to try? What are some things that would be beneficial that don't exist? And I think surveying families and talking with them through small groups and really engaging them in the process of the R&D, really early is critical, because we've seen technologies that have come a pretty long way in their development, and then they realize this isn't practical for reasons A, B, or C. We wish we would have talked to mom or dad or the person with epilepsy earlier. They could have told us, why this wouldn't likely work. So I think just showing up places, we go to a lot of family conferences. There's 25 to 30 different syndromes within epilepsy, and we try to be present. A lot of them have meetings typically every other year, and they're wonderful communities. The way they support each other, the way they share and trade notes and work through adversity. I always leave there thinking, man, these are incredible people, and they inspire us to do more and to try to be better at what we do. So I think, the companies that are just in these arenas, where whether it's a walk or a family conference, or, reaching out to make sure that you're having some one-on-one interactions with families to get their feedback. And that's all really important to, I think, companies that want to exist in our space.
So, Tom, Doug, and I often share an observation, which is we kind of sit in amazement occasionally and look at all the things we've done in the past and go, oh my gosh, how did all these things line up and prepare me so well for this current thing that I'm working on, this, in our case, Cadence. I mean, you have a very interesting background that I think our podcast listeners would enjoy hearing about, that it has occurred to me anyways, that in a lot of ways, maybe the fates set this up, but somehow have prepared you to take on the challenges of this organization. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, it was certainly, at the time it was a big curveball for us, the unexpected nature of Danny passing. And I never anticipated a life in the nonprofit world. I had worked on, I volunteered for a few organizations, and I'd been on the board for an organization called Special Olympics Chicago. But yeah, my background was mostly in communications. I wrote for a magazine right out of college. So I was a writer, a journalist. And then I came back to Chicago, where I'm from, and I was a spokesman for the local state attorney's office. So dealing with adversity and doing it kind of on the spot in some kind of heated, high profile cases was something I learned in those years. But I think, just learning how to communicate with different groups of people has been the theme for my background that has most served me well in this pursuit. Everything we do at Danny Did is about trying to reach the right audience with the right message.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the theme I had noticed, is your background in communicating and trying to form messages and get them out to the public. Seems like great preparation for your current challenges.
Yeah, and a lot of learning on the fly. We spend a lot of time talking to. We're 15 years in now, which is hard to believe, but we still talk with other organizations that were started, by families. Why are you still around? Why do you still exist? And what has helped you get to a bigger level of impact, or bigger scope of fundraising so you can do more with your programs? So I think just having kind of that sense of like always wanting to learn and be ready to figure out how to grow is important to us. And I will say too, like I'm one of 8 kids. We come from a big family, and just the support of our family and our networks in Chicago, I think, has been critical. Like it's been a huge bonus to the fact that Danny Did is still around and that we've been able to grow. So we're very lucky in that way.
Some problems, well, I guess I'll observe that some problems, even though you've got words on paper, like the consensus statement saying, you're supposed to let your patients know about SUDEP and the risks of SUDEP. They're just words on paper. Nothing happens unless there's a living, moving, breathing force behind making sure that people listen to those words. I'm not. It seems like you're in an area where the need for making those words live is never going to go away.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of what we do, is to put, a face behind the need and to expose, the community, the medical community, to a lot of these stories that are very inspirational, and there can be stories that just need to be told. Sometimes it's a story of a family that's still living with epilepsy. Sometimes it's a family that's lost a loved one. But we spend a lot of time trying to engage with the medical community through webinars, and we talk with medical students who are on the front end of their careers. We do grand rounds with epilepsy centers, and it's really always the message that, like, hey, you have the power to help a family make an informed decision. That's your carrot. When you talk to families about all the risks that come with epilepsy, including SUDEP, you're really empowering them. And it's not from a place of fear or a place from, oh God, I can't fathom if this was going to happen. It's really out of respect for the parents, knowing that they can digest information and make decisions accordingly that will help them ultimately reduce risk. That's our message. We're not trying to scare people. We're not trying to, oftentimes we would hear, oh, this is going to produce more anxiety than it will good. And we've heard repeatedly from families and parents and caregivers, we want to know, we want to be informed. We have no capability to make, reduce the risk if we're in the dark.
Tom, maybe you can tell us, help our audience get to know Danny a little bit better. He sounds like he was a wonderful kid and fun to play with and be around with and climb a tree with. So help us get to know him a little better.
Yeah, climbing a tree would be something right up Danny's alley. He was just a great kid, fun kid, third of 4 siblings, and they were all 2 years apart. So Danny was just, perfectly in line, in tandem with running around the neighborhood with his older siblings and their friends. And his name was Daniel George Stanton, and his mom and dad would call him Curious George. He was always, getting into the next thing, and he was always in lockstep with his older brother John. They were best pals. Yeah, his grandma Murtaugh would call him a little toughie. He was a smaller kid in stature, but always in the mix. Just never afraid of anything. He would jump.
You got to do that when you have an older brother, right? You got to learn to throw the elbows and get in there.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. And he wasn't shy about that. But yeah, I smile every time I think about Danny. The hundreds of pictures we have of him. He's always got a smile on his face, and it makes you wonder, what he'd be up to today. He'd be about, 20, 21 years old, and probably, maybe in the middle of his college career and figuring out what he wanted to do with his life. But he brought a lot of joy to us. The name of the foundation comes from the last line of his obituary, and that's something that my brother wrote, and it read, "Please go and enjoy your life." Danny did, and that's where we got the name of our cause, and it's kind of it's a reason for us to share his story, to talk about what kind of kid he was, and he lived with joy. It's caused us to kind of slow down and take one day at a time, and just this mentality that you don't take anything for granted. You enjoy the journey, that kind of thing. And I think a lot of parents and anybody can resonate with that. Life goes fast.
Yeah.
Tragedies can happen, and you really want to kind of smell the roses and slow down and take your time when you've got the opportunity to do that. So Danny's my Danny's my reminder to do that every day. And I'm honored to work and to kind of carry his name forward with the foundation.
You're doing a great job doing that, because again, I look forward to seeing you in those occasional visits. I can sense your joy. I feel it. It makes me joyful, and I want to see the same thing for the rest of the folks at Cadence, who are working really hard. We're trying to get through the final hurdles to start our study. In fact, one of the sites we hope will be in Chicago at Leyde. It makes me joyful hearing you talk about Danny, and then seeing you. You're really effective.
Oh, thanks, Doug. I appreciate it. And I've got to take a minute to give credit to our small team. We started out with our device program in the 2010. I think we gave out 19 grants, and this year we'll do probably close to 1,000. And that's thanks to Mary Duffy, our executive director, and Katie Gaughan, who leads up our device program, and Kelly Sargis and Brendan Duffy. So we've got a great, really committed team. And I always say we try to punch bigger than our weight and do a lot with a little. And that's another thing that we kind of take from Danny's spirit, is kind of, play above your size, if you will, and just be aggressive with how we put epilepsy out into the world, and try to educate. This condition has been around for millennia, for thousands of years, and it's always been stigmatized. It's always been kind of put off into the corners, and we really want to change that dynamic and change the stigma around it, such that people are not so fearful, and realize it's a condition like any other, with people who have, lives and families and friends just like everybody else. And it's a big part of what drives us, is just to try to kind of change the societal perceptions of epilepsy, and make it more of an understood condition.
How about the September, your big meeting coming up in Chicago?
Thinking about resources for the community. Obviously, we're here with our lane of device counseling, and unfortunately, we talk to too many families who have lost somebody, and just try to be an ear for them. There's another collaboration called Partners Against Mortality and Epilepsy, or PAMI, and it's become a really important community of an annual meeting right before AES, where families who have lost loved ones come together with researchers and clinicians, advocates and industry, and really make space for trying to find solutions and sharing stories, motivating each other. Because there's not a lot of instances where a mom who's lost a child can talk with a researcher who's
Right.
studying SUDEP and trying to figure out, why does this happen.
Yep.
Right.
So it's definitely a place of growth and community. And then the chapters and affiliates of the Epilepsy Foundation are frontline resources that are incredibly helpful to the community. Tackling everything from issues in the workplace to schools, and they drive public policy and legislation. You've got the Epilepsy Alliance of America, which has a lot of a great chapter organizations. Cure Epilepsy drives things forward in basic science that is incredibly important, especially right now when some of the federal stuff is changing so much. So we're grateful for all these partners, and just want to do a quick plug for an event that we have in Chicago coming up on September 26th, called An Evening of Hearts and Hugs, named, of course, after Danny. And he would give his dad a hug in bed every night, and then every morning when he woke up. So we generated the name of the event from that daily habit that they had. But it's open to the public. We've got a great community of supporters that comes out. on that night for, kind of a silent auction, and just we share family stories, we show a video, and really just kind of convey the impact and the toll of epilepsy to anybody who's willing to come out and support us that night. So we welcome people to look for that on our website.
Those links are on your website?
Yep, those are all at dannydid.org.
So, Tom, thanks so much for being our official first guest.
My pleasure. It's been an honor, and I've enjoyed watching the growth of Cadence over the years, and I'm glad you're getting close to putting this product into use with the families that need it. It's something that we find hopeful, and the community will find hopeful. So honored to do it and help spread the word.
It's organizations like Danny did motivate everything we do, and they're the reason that we have such an engaged team here, and I'm hoping we get a chance to help these people.
It takes the village, and it's great being part of that village with Danny Did and others.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Big things ahead.
Thanks so much for joining us for Seizure Diaries.
We hope you find these conversations helpful. If you do, we hope you'll consider sharing our podcast with others.
Everybody says it, but it really does help others to discover the show when you rate, review, and share. You can find Seizure Diaries wherever you listen to podcasts.
We'll see you next time.
You're getting better at this.
You say that every time.